All right, so now we're going to look at chapter 13 where we're going to focus in on the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So when we look through these notes, we're going to look at the spinal cord anatomy, we're then going to look at its physiology, and then we're going to look at the spinal nerves themselves. So guys, when we look at the spinal cord, this is actually covered in Lab 17 in your lab book. The spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, of course, and it's housed in this what we call vertebral foramina. Remember that hole that runs through the vertebral column in order for the spinal cord to travel. We also see that the spinal cord is going to be protected by meninges, cerebral spinal fluid, the vertebral ligaments, and also some adipose and muscle tissue. Okay, and you can see those located here where we can see that there's fat tissue, there's also the cerebral spinal fluid and the meninges right around the spinal cord inside of that vertebral foramina. Now let's talk a little bit about these meninges. The meninges are three coverings that surround the spinal cord and brain. The outermost layer is called the dura mater. This is going to be what is known as the tough mother, and it's a dense irregular connective tissue. And guys, it's super tough. You try to pull it apart and you're not able to. Okay. We then see the middle layer is the arachnoid mater. This is the avascular web-like network of fibers. Okay, so it looks kind of like a spider web inside there, and this is going to be where cerebral spinal fluid is going to fill all those spaces. The innermost layer is known as the pia mater. The pia mater is a thin, transparent connective tissue layer, and it's going to stick to the actual surface of the spinal cord in the brain. This is similar to the arachnoid, except for it is highly vascular, which means it has lots of blood vessels present. So meningitis, anytime we add itis to the end of something, it means inflammation. So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, and this can happen due to a number of things. It could be due to a bacterial infection, it could be due to a fungal infection, a viral infection, or even a type of complication of some other infections that don't actually originate in the brain or spinal cord. Because we have these layers of tissues in the meninges, we also have these spaces that are created. The first is called the epidural space, and this is between the dura mater and the inside wall of the vertebral canal. This is filled with adipose or fat tissue. The subdural space is between the dura mater and the arachnoid, and it contains interstitial fluid. So remember, interstitial fluid is just the fluid that's outside of the cells. The subarachnoid space is between the arachnoid and the pia mater, and this is the part that's going to contain the cerebral spinal fluid. So you have the dural space here with the adipose tissue, the subdural space, which is going to have interstitial fluid, and then of course the subarachnoid, which is going to contain the cerebral spinal fluid. There's also going to be these special structures in the spinal cord called the denticulate ligaments. These are triangular shaped, thickened extensions of the pia mater, which is going to help hold the spinal cord in place and protect it against shock. Okay, so that when you go running and things like that and you're jarring your back, it's not causing the spinal cord to move up and down through your back. It's held in place. It's anchored by these ligaments, which again are these extensions of the pia mater. All right, so we have a little overview here that's looking at labeling a lot of these structures. All right, so you have your word list over here, and if we look at A, what is A? A is going to be a spinal nerve. It's also known as a mixed nerve because it's going to, again, have sensory and motor function to it. B is going to be the denticulate ligament. See, it's a triangle-shaped extension of the pia mater. C is talking about a space, and so this is going to be the subarachnoid space. It's between the arachnoid layer and the pia. We then see the other space. D is the subdural space. E is the pia mater, which is the inner layer of the meninges. F is the arachnoid mater, which is the middle. And then G is the outer layer of the meninges, which is the dura mater. So make sure that you take a look at these structures. So let's take a look at the external anatomy of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord begins as a continuation of the medulla oblongata, which is the lower portion of the brain stem. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which are going to exit laterally to the sides out into your body tissues. Okay, so there's 31 pairs, which means you have a total of 62. When we look at these, they are going to be broken down into their location where you have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. These are going to end at about L2. When we talk about the spinal cord, it's going to end or taper down at about L2 in adults. In newborns, it's about L3 to L4. The spinal cord stops growing at approximately 4 to 5 years of age, and the vertebral column does continue to get longer as you get taller. There are some cervical and some lumbar enlargements that are present in the spinal cord. They are going to serve points of origin for nerves that are going to travel to your arms when we talk about the cervical enlargement, and then the lumbar enlargement are going to be the nerves that service the legs. So if you'll recall here, we have the tapered distal end that's going to take place between the L1 and L2 when we look at those particular vertebrae. This is called the coneus medullaris. We then see the roots of the inferior spinal nerves are going to continue down the spinal column. They're going to exit the spinal cord at L1 but remain inside the canal to some point until they get to that lower point and they exit out to their area. This is going to be known as the quada equina, and it does look like a horse's tail because it's just a bunch of nerves coming through here. We also see that there is an extension of the pia mater, which is going to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx, and this is called the filum terminal. Okay, it's going to anchor it down, and so that way it does not pull up and down also as you move. Now guys, a spinal tap is also known as a lumbar puncture. It's to remove cerebral spinal fluid from the subarachnoid space. We do this a lot of times to diagnose meningitis. We look at the cerebral spinal fluid and we're going to look to see if it's cloudy, if it's discolored, if it has microorganisms present in it, that sort of thing. But we also will use this a lot of times in the subarachnoid space to introduce antibiotics, anesthetics, chemotherapy, or even contrast media if we need to do certain kinds of scans. All right, so now let's take a look at the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. So when we look at the internal anatomy, the spinal cord is partially divided into a right and left side. This is due to the anterior median fissure. Remember, anterior is the front, and this is a deep, wide groove, okay, that's on the front or belly side. We then see that there's a posterior median sulcus, which is going to be a little more shallow, and this is on the back or dorsal side. Gray matter and white matter, which we did talk about back in chapter 12. The gray matter in the spinal cord is going to be shaped like an H or a butterfly, and it is then surrounded by the white matter. Now remember, the gray matter is going to contain cell bodies, neuroglial cells, and unmyelinated axons and dendrites. There's no myelin in the gray matter. That's why it appears gray. There's also going to be masses or collections of cell bodies and dendrites inside of this part of the gray matter, and these are known as the nucleus. Remember, the nucleus is a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system. Now, there's also a central canal, which is a small space in the center of the gray matter. This is also known as the gray commissure. It runs the entire length of the spinal cord, and it does contain cerebral spinal fluid. Now at the top, it's going to actually merge with the fourth ventricle, which is a space inside the medulla oblongata. And this is where cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow all the way down. Now, when it's known as the gray commissure, guys, commissure means a crossing over, and this is where nerves can actually desiccate or cross over from one side to the other side in the spinal cord. The gray matter is divided into horns. We have the posterior or dorsal horns. They're closer to the back of the spinal cord, and these are going to contain the cell bodies of interneurons and terminal axons of sensory neurons. Okay, so the dorsal gray horns are going to contain more of the sensory neurons. The anterior or ventral gray horns are going to be closer to the front, and they're going to contain the cell nuclei or cell bodies of the somatic motor nerves. These are the ones that are going to talk to the skeletal muscles. Okay, so the back is going to be where sensory information comes in. The front is going to be where the motor information is going to come out. Now, this gray matter is divided into those horns, but we do see that there is a lateral gray horn that's going to be between the anterior and posterior horns, but this is only found in the thoracic and upper lumbar areas of the spinal cord. These contain the cell bodies for the autonomic motor neurons, and these are going to talk to your smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and your glands. So you're only going to find these in the thoracic region and the upper lumbar areas, and you can see it here in this picture. They're in between the anterior and posterior horns. Now, the white matter, on the other hand, is located around the peripheral of the spinal cord, the outside. Remember, in the brain, this is switched. We do see that it contains bundles of many myelinated motor and sensory axons. These are going to be divided into what we call columns, okay, because they're running up and down the spinal cord, so we're going to call them columns. We have what we call the anterior ventral white columns. This is going to be the right and left front, and they're going to be between the anterior gray horns. We also have the posterior dorsal white columns. There's going to be a right and left rear, and these are going to be between the posterior gray horns. There are some lateral white columns, again, right and left sides, and they're going to be between the anterior and posterior. And each column, guys, is going to contain a bundle of tracts, which we call a bundle of nerves that we call tracts in the central nervous system. They're also going to be known as fasciculi when we get to talking about them in anatomy too. Now the white matter tracts are going to carry sensory information up, and in this picture you'll notice the sensory information is going to travel up through the blue tracts. The motor information is going to come down from the brain to the rest of the body through these red motor tracts. The gray matter is going to receive and integrate all of these messages, because remember they're the cell bodies and the dendrites, so they're going to receive the information, decide how it needs to be sent up, down, that sort of thing. So when we look at this little overview here, you have your mixed nerve. When the mixed nerve comes in, we see that there's going to be a sensory and motor portion. Okay, so we see that the sensory portion is shown in blue and the motor portion is shown in red, with the interneuron shown in the purple. We also see in this particular case there are, because this is part of the thoracic upper lumbar area, there is going to be an autonomic motor neuron that comes through here as well, which is shown in green. All right, so let's look at the spinal cord physiology, the functions of the spinal cord. The whole point is to connect the nervous system with the rest of the body. Okay, so it's going to connect the brain to the rest of the body. And it's going to provide a control center for spinal reflexes. Spinal reflexes are going to be things like your patellar reflex, which is that reflex at your knee whenever they hit you with that little hammer and it kicks your leg out, or the Achilles, or so on. We do have these ascending tracts which are going to carry information towards the brain. They're going to take it up to the brain, and remember these are shown in blue. They're going to carry the impulses for pain, temperature, touch, deep pressure, and vibration, as well as what we call proprioception. Now guys, proprioception is the awareness of your posture. And one example of these are called the spinal somatic tract. Okay, it's taking it up from the spinal cord to the thalamus in the brain. We also see that the posterior column tracts are going to send the sensory information of pain, temperature, touch, deep pressure, vibration, and proprioception up from your skin and your muscles. So these are going to take information from your skin and your muscles up to your brain. And then we see the descending motor tracts. They're going to carry information from the brain down the spinal cord to the skeletal muscles. There's two main tracts. There's the direct, or what we call the pyramidal tracts. These are going to originate in the cerebral cortex, and this is more for your conscious types of movements. For your skeletal muscles that you have voluntary control over, they're going to also help you coordinate and do skilled movements, like precise movements like tying your shoe or buttoning, buttoning your buttons, that sort of thing. We see the indirect or extrapyramidal tracts are going to originate in the brainstem, and these are going to be more unconscious, and they're going to be more of your autonomic movements. These are like involuntary control, like for your posture, your balance, or your orientation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about reflexes. A reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response to a change in the environment that helps to maintain homeostasis. Now, reflexes help to maintain homeostasis by allowing the body to make rapid adjustments to this type of imbalance that occurs. Now, there are different types of reflexes. There are spinal reflexes, which are the integration is going to occur in the gray matter of the spinal cord. This is like your patellar reflex with your knee, your Achilles, crossed extensor, flexor withdrawal reflexes. We also have your cranial reflexes, which are going to use your cranial nerves. These are going to occur in the gray matter of your brainstem, and this is like your gag reflex, your pupillary light reflex with your pupil, and your corneal blink reflex. Now, with these types of reflexes, we're going to look at some somatic reflexes. These involve contraction of your skeletal muscles, which are voluntary. Some somatic reflexes are spinal and others are cranial. And we also have autonomic or visceral reflexes. These are going to be controlled by your sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. And this is going to involve smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland responses. These are involuntary. Now, some autonomic reflexes are spinal and others are going to be cranial. So let's look at a reflex arc. It doesn't matter really what kind of reflex we're looking at. It's the simplest type of neural circuit or pathway, and it at least has one synapsis and has 5 components to it. So the first component is the receptor. This is going to respond to some sort of stimulus. It causes an impulse. In this case, it's showing you that attack is going through the skin. The sensory neuron is going to carry the impulse from the receptor to the integrating center. So the receptor is going to detect that something is wrong, and now it's going to send the signal towards the spinal cord, towards the central nervous system. It then is going to go into the integrating system inside of the central nervous system, and then it's going to decide what needs to be done about that particular stimulus. 4 is the motor neuron. This is going to carry the impulse from the integrating center to the effector. So it's going to carry it out, and it's going to go either to a skeletal muscle, it's going to go to a cardiac muscle gland, depending on what kind of reflex we're looking at. The effector is that muscle or gland. It's going to respond to the motor nerve impulse that's present. Okay, so we have the receptor, sensory neuron, integrating center, motor neuron, and then the effector. So when we look at somatic spinal reflexes, there are different types. There are stretch reflexes, tendon reflexes. There's also a flexor withdrawal reflex and a what we call crossed extensor reflex. So the first picture is showing you more of like a stretch reflex. The second is a flexor, and then we see, the second is what we call a tendon reflex, and then we see the crossed extensor reflex. You'll notice that the crossed extensor reflex is a lot more complicated than the others. So let's talk about a stretch reflex first. This is also known as a myostatic reflex, and the purpose of this reflex is to prevent overstretching. Okay, so it's a stretch receptor in the muscle spindles or the tendon organs, and these are going to help with proprioception, so proprioceptors. They are what we call monosynaptic. They contain one sensory neuron and one motor neuron, and they are going to talk directly to each other. So this is going to be 2 neurons with 1 synapsis in between, like you see here in this picture. The synapsis, though, does take place in the gray matter in the spinal cord in this example. In others, they can be what we call polysynaptic reflex arcs. These are going to be with antagonistic muscles, so these are the opposite muscles. When we see that they're polysynaptic, you're going to have at least 3 neurons and at least 2 synapses. This means a sensory neuron is going to talk to the association or intermediate neuron, and then it's going to talk to the motor neuron. All right, so you can see it here. We see the stimulus comes in through the sensory neuron. It talks to that red neuron in the actual spinal cord, and then the message gets sent out through the blue motor neuron here. Now, some reflexes are what we call EPSA Lateral. This is where the sensory input is going to enter the spinal cord on the same side as the motor impulse is going to leave the spinal cord. So note that all monosynaptic reflexes are going to be EPSA Lateral because there's no interneuron that's present. Okay, and so because of that, it's going to all be on the same side of the body. Now, reciprocal innervation is going to be where a neural circuit which causes simultaneous contraction of one muscle group and relaxation of another muscle group. This prevents conflict of opposing muscles to take place. This is very important in our whole idea of coordinating our muscle movements. And so when we look at this example here is in the knee jerk or the patellar reflex. When they hit that patellar tendon, we see that there's going to be contraction of the quadricep muscles, but there's got to be relaxation of the hamstring muscles. Okay, so this is the idea of the reciprocal innervation because the dotted line is showing you the reciprocal. It's going to the opposite muscles and telling it to relax instead of contract. Now, a tendon reflex, the purpose is to prevent damage, which is tearing to tendons, which is caused by too much tension. This controls muscle tension by causing the muscles to relax. These are also ipsilateral reflexes, but they are polysynaptic. They do have what we call this reciprocal innervation that is present. So just like we just talked about, we see that the quad has got to engage and contract, but the hamstring has to relax. A flexor withdrawal reflex, the purpose is to be protective. It's going to help you move a limb to avoid potential pain. These are going to be ipsilateral and also polysynaptic, so they're going to be on the same side. Now, reciprocal innervation is going to use motor neurons that are called flexor muscles in the thigh to contract in this case, which moves the limb, causing the extensor muscles of the same leg to relax. So it's allowing you to pull your foot up. So let's just say you stepped on something. Okay, it could be a Lego, a tack, a Barbie brush, whatever it might be. You stepped on it, it causes pain, and you pull your foot up. This is a flexor reflex. So the flexor muscles are going to contract to pull the leg up, and the extensors have to relax. So again, reciprocal innervation takes place. Now, cross extensor reflex also is going to take place if you're standing up. This is a protective reflex to help you maintain your balance during a flexor reflex. So you pulled that one leg up, but you're standing now on one of your legs and you're trying to keep your balance. That is the cross extensor reflex. This is polysynaptic, but it is considered contralateral because the sensory impulse came from your, say, your right foot when you stepped on that Lego and you pull it up, but your left foot now has to help hold you up. So the sensory impulses enter from one side of the spinal cord, but the motor impulses go out of the opposite side. There's also some reciprocal innervation that happens here. So here's how it works. You step on the tack with your right foot. Your right leg withdraws from the pain. That's the flexor reflex. But additional association neurons cause your extensor muscles in your left leg to contract so that your left leg stays extended so that you stay upright against gravity. So guys, reflexes are often used to diagnose and assess nervous system problems. If a reflex is absent or abnormal, there could be damage or injured tissue that could be located somewhere along a particular conduction path. So examples of clinical significant somatic spinal reflexes are going to be the patellar reflex, the knee jerk. This is tested in lab 19. And this is a stretch reflex. You tap the patellar ligament and we see contraction of the quadricep femoris and extension of the knee joint. We also see the Achilles reflex, also known as the ankle jerk. This is a stretch reflex. You tap the cacanal tendon, or what we call the Achilles tendon, and you see an actual contraction of the gastroc and soleus muscles. It causes the foot to plantar flex. There's also what we call the Babinski sign. This is known as plantar flexion. You can take a look at this video here. You gently stroke the lateral or outer margin of the sole of the foot. This causes extension or straightening out of the great toe or other toes. This is normal in children if they are younger than 1.5 years of age. Okay, it causes their toes to fan out. But we want a negative Babinski sign as we get older. Normally when we break something across our foot, we pull our toes in. That is what we call a negative Babinski sign. If there's a positive Babinski sign where we still see the toes move out when the person is older than 1.5 years, that's abnormal and there's something wrong with the corticospinal tract. Okay, and so there is an issue. And so you can watch some of these videos that are talking about these reflexes. So examples of somatic cranial reflexes are like the gag reflex or the corneal blink reflex. All right, so let's talk a little bit about spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They are identified according to their region and level of the spinal cord where they exit. Okay, now remember, they are going to exit out of the intervertebral foramen. Those little spaces between the foramen, the spinal nerves are going to exit out. Now there's one exception, which is the C1. When we look at this, there are 5 regions. There are the cervical spinal nerves. There's going to be 8 pairs, so C1 to C8. The first pair leaves above C1 and the last pair leaves below C7. There's thoracic, which are 12 pairs of nerves, so T1 through T12. The lumbar has 5, so it's L1 through L5. Now remember, the spinal cord does end about L1, L2, so we do see the rest of these, when we talk about the rest of the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal are going to travel down that quadra equina area. The sacral, there are 5 pairs, so there's S1 to S5, and the coccygeal, there is 1 pair. Now, each spinal nerve has 2 separate points of attachment to the spinal cord. There is a dorsal or back root. This contains the accessory axons and the ganglion, which are the accessory or sensory cell bodies. So remember, there's going to be like this bulge area that's part of the dorsal root where these cell bodies are going to be located. The ventral or anterior root is going to contain the motor axons, and the cell bodies for the motor neurons are going to be found in the anterior horns of the gray matter. These roots are going to unite in what we call the intervertebral foramen, and they're going to be called the spinal nerve. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves because they contain both sensory and motor fibers. Now, when you put pressure on a nerve, it can actually cause your foot to like go to sleep. When we talk about like when your leg goes to sleep and it comes and starts tingling back when it wakes up, that's because you put pressure on that nerve and kind of kinked it, and whenever the pressure's off, it starts to send signals again. Nerves are going to be wrapped in connective tissue, which we did talk about in chapter 12 as well. Remember that the epineurium is going to cover the entire nerve. It's going to be fused with the dura mater of the spinal meninges at the intervertebral foramen. We then see that the perineurium is going to surround a fascicle or bundle of individual axons, and then the endoneurium is going to surround each individual axon, or myelinated, or it could be either a myelinated or unmyelinated axon. Now, there are some things that we call plexus that are going to be present here with these spinal nerves. These are networks of adjacent nerves. They have what we call ventral rami, and there's 4 major plexuses in your body. Okay, there's the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. Now, spinal nerves of T2 to T12 do not form a plexus. These are going to talk to the intercostal muscles. They're also going to innervate the skin and that sort of thing. Now, these are called dermatomes in the skin segment, which is innervated by a spinal nerve. All spinal nerves except C1 innervate specific constant segments of the skin. Dermatomes help doctors to determine which segment of the spinal cord or which spinal nerve may be damaged. So if we take a look here in the cervical plexus, C1 through C4 plus C5, we see that they're going to talk to the skin and muscles of the head, neck, and upper shoulders. And specifically, the pharynx nerve is going to talk to the diaphragm, which is super important for breathing. In the brachial plexus, we have C5 through T1. These are going to contain major nerves like the musculocutaneous, which is going to allow you to move your biceps muscle, the ulnar, which is going to communicate with the flexor carpi ulnaris and your little finger, and the radial, which is going to communicate with your triceps brachii. The lumbar is L1 through L4. One of its major nerves is the femoral. This one is going to specifically talk to the quadriceps, and we see that it's going to innervate the areas of your anterolateral abdominal wall, genitals, and legs. The sacral is L4 through S4. These are going to have the sciatic branches. They're going to get information. They're going to innervate the buttocks, perineum, genitals, and legs. The sciatic branches are going to communicate with the hamstrings. The tibial part of the sciatic is going to talk to the calf and plantar surface of your foot. And the perineal fibular is going to talk to your shin, communicate with your shin and top surface of your foot. Here it just gives you an example of these functional nerves. It shows you which nerve talks to each area, what it innervates, and possible symptoms that can come if damage to that nerve does occur.